I used to think love meant staying, no matter how tired you felt. I'm okay, Emily would say, sitting on the edge of the bed, eyes fixed on the floor. I'm just empty. I would move closer and ask, did something happen today? She would shake her head and whisper, it's the depression again. I believed her, because believing her felt easier than doubting the woman I married. I'll cover the therapy bill this month, I told her one night. Don't worry about it. She looked at me with tired gratitude and said, you always save me. Those words mattered to me. I worked longer hours, canceled trips, skipped sleep. When she cried at 3 a.m, I sat up and said, talk to me. I'm here. She would lean against my shoulder and murmur, I don't deserve you. I took that as love, not a warning. Still, something felt off. Our conversations grew shorter. I'm exhausted, she'd say. Can we talk tomorrow? Tomorrow became silence. When I reached for her hand, she pulled away gently and said, I just need space. I nodded and replied, take all the space you need. I'm not going anywhere. Inside, I felt invisible, but I told myself this was what support looked like. Mark noticed before I did. We were having coffee when he asked, are you sure Emily's okay? I laughed it off. She's struggling, that's all. He frowned and said, man, struggling doesn't usually look like shutting your husband out. I snapped back, you don't know her like I do. He raised his hands and replied, I hope you're right. I hated that doubt stayed with me after he left. That night, I asked her directly, did I do something wrong? She sighed and said, no, this is about me, not you. I pressed, then why does it feel like you're leaving? She looked at me, eyes glossy, and whispered, I would never leave you. I wanted to believe that sentence more than anything I had ever wanted before. Weeks passed like this. I paid bills, cooked dinners, waited up late. Thank you for being patient, she told me once. I smiled and said, we're a team. But teams talk, and we barely spoke anymore. When I asked about her day, she replied, it was fine, and turned away. I stared at the ceiling and told myself love meant endurance. One evening, she sat across from me at the kitchen table. Her hands were shaking. I need to tell you something, she said. My heart raced as I asked, is it about your meds? She shook her head slowly. I think I need to stay somewhere else for a while. I laughed nervously. Like a vacation? She swallowed and said, a temporary separation. The word hit me hard, but I forced a calm voice. If that helps you heal, then okay. She reached for my hand and said, this doesn't mean I don't love you. I squeezed back and replied, I trust you. Inside, fear screamed, but I ignored it. I watched her pack a small bag later that night and told myself this was part of saving our marriage. As the door closed behind her, I whispered, we'll get through this. I didn't know I had just agreed to lose everything. Before she left, she paused in the hallway and said, promise me you won't give up on us. I answered too quickly, I never will. She nodded, relief flashing across her face, and replied, that's why I need you. After she left, I called Mark and said, she just needs time. He hesitated, then asked, are you sure this isn't more than that? I replied, please don't turn this into something ugly. He sighed and said, I'm worried about you. Alone, I replayed every conversation in my head. Maybe I should have listened better, I told myself. Maybe I asked too much. I opened my phone, typed a message, deleted it, then typed again. I love you. Take all the time you need, I sent. She replied hours later, thank you for understanding. That single sentence kept me hopeful. I went to bed believing patience would fix what honesty never touched. I didn't know then that love without truth is just waiting in the dark. I closed my eyes and chose faith over fear, not realizing the breaking point had already begun. I believed her silence meant pain, not betrayal, and that belief felt safer then. Back then. The apartment felt wrong the first night Emily wasn't there. I stood in the kitchen and said out loud, she just needs time. The walls didn't answer. I texted her, "Did you eat?" No reply. An hour later I wrote, "Just checking in." Still nothing. When she finally responded with, "Sorry, long day," I told myself that was normal. "Therapy drains her," I whispered, like the room needed convincing. When we did talk, her voice sounded lighter. "Dr. Harris says I'm making progress," she told me one night. I asked, "Progress how?" She replied, "I'm learning to breathe again." I smiled and said, "I'm proud of you." After we hung up, I stared at my phone and wondered why breathing no longer included me. I sent, "Do you want me to come by?" She answered, "Not yet." I said, "Okay," even though my chest hurt. Days turned into missed calls. I left voicemails saying, "I'm here, and I miss you." She texted less, but when she did, she sounded fine. "I laughed today," she said once. I asked, "With who?" She paused, then said, "People." That answer stayed with me. At night, I lay awake and replayed our last conversations, asking myself, did I push too hard? I blamed myself because blaming her felt impossible. Mark stopped by one evening and asked, "How are you really?" I shrugged and said, "She's healing." He sat down and said, "You don't sound convinced." I snapped, "She's depressed, not cheating." He hesitated, then asked, "Is Daniel back in her life?" I stood up and said, "That's unfair." He replied, "I'm just asking." I raised my voice and said, "Stop looking for problems." He went quiet and said, "I'm worried about you," not judging her. After he left, I paced the room and muttered, "They don't understand." I texted Emily again. "Mark thinks we should talk more." She replied, "I don't have the energy for that." I typed, "I need you," then erased it and sent, "Take care of yourself." She reacted with a heart emoji. That small symbol kept me hopeful longer than it should have. Sleep became optional. I watched the ceiling and thought, if I'm patient enough, she'll come back. I reread old messages where she wrote, "You're my safe place." I whispered, "Then why am I alone?" Every morning, I checked my phone before getting out of bed. Every night, I fell asleep with it in my hand. Silence grew louder than any argument we ever had. One afternoon, Mark called and said, "Have you seen her lately?" I replied, "She needs privacy." He sighed and said, "Privacy isn't disappearance." I answered sharply, "You're crossing a line." He paused, then said, "I hope I'm wrong." I ended the call and told myself loyalty meant defense, even when doubt burned. That evening, I opened social media without thinking. I scrolled past news, jokes, strangers. Then I froze. Emily's name appeared, tagged in a photo I didn't expect to see. She was smiling, really smiling, standing next to someone I didn't recognize at first. My heart raced as I looked closer. Her hand rested gently on her stomach. I whispered, "No," even though no one was there to hear me. I stared at the photo like it was a mistake the internet would fix if I refreshed. "That's not real," I said. My finger hovered, then tapped again. Same image. Emily smiling, arm around Daniel, her stomach round under a loose dress. "She isn't pregnant," I whispered. "She can't be." My heart started racing, and I heard myself say, "Calm down," even though nothing felt calm. I called her. "Emily, what is this?" She answered softly, "What do you mean?" I said, "The photo. Daniel posted it." She paused, then said, "It's old." I laughed, sharp and scared. "Old how?" She replied, "From before." I asked, "Before what?" She said, "Before things got bad." I snapped, "That's not an answer." She breathed out and said, "Please don't do this right now." "Don't do what?" I asked. "Notice?" She said, "I didn't want you to find out like this." I felt cold. "Find out what?" I asked. She whispered, "I'm pregnant." I said, "That's impossible." She replied, "It just happened." I said, "Happened when?" She said, "I don't know." time got away from me. I said, Emily, we were married. She said, I know. I asked, whose baby? She stayed quiet. I said, say it. She said, Daniel's. I felt something tear inside me. When did you see him? I asked. She said, we reconnected. I said, when? She replied, months ago. I said, while you were sick? She said, please don't call it that. I said, well, I paid for therapy? She said, I didn't plan this. I called Daniel before I could stop myself. He answered and said, you shouldn't be calling. I said, you posted the photo. He replied, I didn't hide anything. I asked, did you know she was married? He said, she told me everything. I said, tell me to my face. He laughed and said, let go. I said, you destroyed my life. He replied, you lost her. I went back to Emily. You're living with him, I said. She replied, sometimes. I asked, how long? She said, since the separation. I said, you asked for space. She said, I needed support. I said, and the baby? She said, I'm keeping it. I asked, what about us? She said, I can't go back. I said, so that's it? She said, I hope you understand. I didn't understand. Numbers crashed in my head. Dates didn't fit. Lies stacked on lies. I said, you used me. She replied, I was confused. I said, you were planning. She cried and said, I'm sorry. I said, are you? She said, I have to choose my future. I said, you already did. She whispered, with or without you. I hung up and stared at the photo again. Her smile looked practiced now. I said out loud, this is real. My chest burned as the truth settled. She hadn't drifted away. She had replaced me, and the proof was growing inside her. I called her back. Tell me the dates, I said. She answered, why does it matter? I said, because the math matters. She said, I was scared. I said, you were careful. She said, I didn't mean to hurt you. I said, you managed. I asked, did everyone know? She said, no. I said, Mark? She said, no. I said, your sister? She said, she suspected. I laughed and said, I was the last. I sat on the floor and said, I built my life around you. She replied, I didn't ask you to. I said, you didn't stop me. She said, I didn't know how. I said, you knew how to leave. She cried and said, please don't hate me. I said, I don't know what I feel. She said, I never meant to replace you. I said, yet here we are. I looked at the photo again and said, you look happy. She said, I'm trying to be. I asked, was I ever enough? She went quiet. That silence answered me. I said, so this is your choice? She said, yes. I said, then stop calling it confusion. She said, I'm sorry. I said, goodbye. I ended the call and pressed my hands to my face. Think, I told myself. I said, breathe. The room felt smaller. My phone buzzed, then stopped. I didn't check it. I said out loud, this wasn't an accident. I remembered every night she said she was tired, every time she said she needed space. I said, you were already gone. The realization hurt, but it was clean. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't cruel. I was lied to, and now I knew. I sat alone and whispered, this changes everything. No one answered. The silence finally spoke, and it told me the marriage I trusted was already over for me now forever. I met Emily at a quiet cafe because she said, public places feel safer. I nodded and replied, whatever makes this easier. She didn't look sick anymore. She looked calm. I sat down and said, just tell me the truth. She wrapped her hands around her cup and said, I didn't know how to leave without hurting you. I asked, so you lied? She said, I exaggerated. I repeated, exaggerated what? She answered, the depression. I laughed once, bitter and loud. So all those nights? She said, some of them were real. I leaned forward and asked, which ones? She looked away and said, I don't know. I said, you cried in my arms. She replied, I felt guilty. I said, you said you were broken. She said, I was scared. I said, you weren't sick. She whispered, I just didn't want to fight. Rachel sat beside her, silent. I looked at Rachel and said, did you know? She shifted and said, I knew something was wrong. I asked, wrong with her or wrong with me? She didn't answer. Emily said, this isn't fair. I snapped, neither was lying to your husband. Emily flinched and said, you were safe. I repeated, safe? She nodded and said, predictable. Kind. I asked, and that was bad? She swallowed and said, Daniel made me feel alive. Those words crushed something in me. I said, alive enough to betray me? She said, I didn't mean it like that. I replied, but you meant it. She looked at me and said, I didn't want this to happen. I said, you planned it. She shook her head and said, I drifted. I said, you chose. She said, I was afraid to hurt you. I laughed and said, congratulations. Rachel finally spoke. Emily, maybe stop. Emily snapped, don't. I looked at Rachel and said, you won't defend me. Rachel whispered, I'm sorry. That apology felt empty. I turned back to Emily and said, how long were you pretending? She answered, longer than I should have. I said, every therapy bill? She nodded. I said, every night I begged you to talk? She nodded again. I said, you watched me blame myself. She said, I hated myself for it. I replied, not enough to stop. She started crying and said, I never wanted to hurt you. I said, then why does this feel so deliberate? She said, I didn't know how to leave a good man. I said, so you broke him instead. She covered her face and said, please don't say that. I leaned back and felt something shift. You didn't love me, I said. She replied, I loved what you gave me. I nodded slowly. Stability, I said. Money, I added. Patience. She whispered, you're twisting this. I said, no, I'm finally seeing it straight. Rachel stood up and said, maybe we should go. I looked at her and said, you can. Emily reached for my hand. I never meant for you to feel used. I pulled back and said, but I was. She said, you're still a good man. I answered, that doesn't undo what you did. She said, I didn't want to be the villain. I said, yet here we are. She cried harder and said, what do you want from me? I said, honesty, for once. She took a breath and said, I stayed because it was easier than leaving. That sentence settled everything. I stood up and said, thank you. She looked up, confused. For what? She asked. I said, for finally telling the truth. Rachel avoided my eyes as I walked past her. Emily said, wait. I stopped but didn't turn around. She said, I never meant to replace you. I replied, but you did. Outside, the air felt sharp. I said to myself, don't beg. I remembered every time I tried to fix something she was already done with. I said, don't chase. She had already run. I walked away feeling hollow, but clear. I finally understood I wasn't abandoned because I failed. I was abandoned because I was convenient. That truth hurt, but it freed me. I didn't know how to file for divorce, so I said to myself, just show up. Laura greeted me with a calm voice and said, sit down. I replied, I feel like I'm doing something wrong. She looked at me and said, you're protecting yourself. I asked, from my own wife? She nodded and said, from the damage she's already done. She slid papers toward me and said, you have options. I asked, does she? Laura said, she made choices. I rubbed my face and said, I still feel guilty. Laura replied, guilt doesn't mean you're wrong. I said, she's pregnant. Laura said, that doesn't erase betrayal. I stared at the forms and whispered, she'll regret this. Laura looked up and said, most people do, eventually. Mark waited outside and asked, how did it go? I said, it feels final. He said, good. I snapped, how can you say that? He replied, because staying would finish breaking you. I sighed and said, I still love who I thought she was. Mark said, that woman doesn't exist anymore. His honesty hurt, but it kept me standing. Emily started texting again. I'm sorry, she wrote. An hour later she added, you pushed me away. I stared at the screen and said out loud, pick one. I typed nothing. The next day she wrote, I miss you. Then, you never listened. My hand shook as I locked my phone. I told myself, silence is dignity. It felt weak at first, then necessary. Eating became a task. I told myself, just swallow. Sleeping felt impossible. I lay in bed and said, tomorrow I'll feel better. Tomorrow kept lying. I showered, dressed, showed up to work, and answered questions I barely heard. Are you okay? People asked. I said, I'm fine, because it ended the conversation. Laura called and said, she wants to negotiate. I replied, about what? Laura said, control. I laughed and said, she already lost that. Laura paused and said, stay calm. I answered, I'm done reacting. That felt like progress. Mark texted, proud of you. I didn't reply, but I felt it. The signing day came quietly. Emily sat across from me, her stomach visible now. She wouldn't look up. I said, are you ready? She whispered, I think so. Laura slid the papers over. Emily's hand shook as she signed. I watched and felt nothing I expected. No rage. No relief. Just distance. Emily looked up once and said, I never wanted this. I replied, you chose it. She said, I didn't think it would end like this. I said, neither did I. She signed the last page and pushed it away. I stood up and said, take care of yourself. She nodded without meeting my eyes. As I walked out, I realized the woman I loved existed only in memory. I wasn't walking away from my wife. I was walking away from a stranger, and that hurt more than staying ever could. That night, I called Laura again and said, what if I'm making a mistake? She replied, you're choosing peace over chaos. I asked, what if she changes? Laura said, change doesn't erase patterns. I said, I keep thinking about revenge. She answered, then don't act on it. I asked, why? She said, because dignity lasts longer. Mark came over with food and said, eat. I said, I'm not hungry. He replied, your body doesn't care. I took a bite and said, she keeps blaming me. Mark said, that's easier than accountability. I asked, will this stop hurting? He said, it will hurt differently. I nodded and said, I can survive different. Emily sent one last message. Please don't shut me out. I read it and whispered, you shut me out first. I didn't answer. I deleted the thread and felt a strange calm. I looked at the signed papers and said, this is real. My hand steadied as I folded them. I said, I'm still here. That was enough for today. I stood by the window and said, this hurts. No one argued. I breathed in and out and told myself, keep going. The pain didn't disappear, but it stopped controlling me. For the first time in months, I felt the weight shift. I wasn't healed. I wasn't happy. I was moving, and that mattered. I promised myself I would eat tomorrow, sleep longer, and speak kinder to myself, because surviving this moment meant choosing life over the comfort of familiar pain without looking back again ever. Life didn't rebuild itself loudly. It happened in small choices. Go to work, I told myself. Eat something. I started running in the mornings and said out loud, 1 mile is enough today. At work, Sophia noticed and asked, new routine? I shrugged and said, trying to breathe better. She smiled and replied, that's a good goal. She never asked why. That made me trust her. We worked late one evening, and she said, you don't talk much about your past. I replied, I'm learning not to live there. She nodded and said, that takes strength. I laughed softly. It takes practice. She didn't flirt. She didn't push. She treated me like a person, not a project. That felt rare. Mark called one night and said, you heard about Daniel? I said, no, he replied, he lost his job. I paused and said, that's rough. Mark waited, then asked, that's it? I answered honestly, it's not my problem. Saying that felt strange and freeing. Mark said, Emily's been stressed. I said, I hope the baby's healthy. I meant it, and that surprised me. Rachel messaged me a week later. Can we talk? She wrote. I hesitated, then replied, okay. On the phone, she said, she isn't as happy as she looks. I said, I'm not involved. Rachel sighed and said, Daniel's angry all the time. I asked, why tell me? She answered, because you deserved the truth back then. I said, I have it now. At work, Sophia asked, coffee? I said, sure. She looked at me and said, you seem lighter. I replied, I stopped carrying things that weren't mine. She smiled and said, that shows. We talked about books, work stress, and plans. Nothing heavy. Nothing hidden. I realized peace didn't need fireworks. Emily texted once. I hope you're okay. I read it and said to myself, I am. I didn't reply. Mark later said, she's struggling. I asked, do you want me to feel bad? He paused and said, no. I nodded and said, good. That chapter of my life had ended. Rachel sent another message. She misses you. I typed, erased, then sent, tell her I wish her well. Rachel replied, that's kinder than she deserves. I stared at that sentence and thought, kindness isn't weakness anymore. I had learned the difference. Sophia noticed my phone buzz and asked, everything okay? I said, old noise. She replied, you don't have to explain. That respect felt like oxygen. I said, thank you. She answered, anytime. I realized healing didn't mean forgetting. It meant choosing what deserved my attention. One evening, Mark said, karma's doing its thing. I replied, I'm not watching. He laughed and said, you changed. I said, I had to. I wasn't celebrating their stress. I wasn't mourning it either. I felt something steadier. Balance. At home, I cooked dinner and said out loud, this is my life now. The quiet didn't scare me. I slept through the night for the first time in months. In the morning, I stretched and said, I'm okay. That felt true. Sophia walked with me after work and said, you ever think about starting over? I replied, I think about continuing. She smiled and said, that's better. I watched her leave and felt gratitude without attachment. I wasn't desperate. I wasn't empty. I was present. Rachel sent one last message. She regrets how she treated you. I read it and whispered, regret isn't repair. I deleted the chat. Not out of anger, but because I didn't need updates anymore. I stood by my window and said, I survived. The words didn't shake. They grounded me. Emily's life was unraveling, but mine was stitching itself back together. I didn't win by watching her fall. I won by standing back up. That night, I turned off my phone and told myself, keep living. No drama followed. No apology arrived. Just silence, and this time, the silence felt peaceful. I realized karma doesn't rush. It waits. And while it waited for them, I finally moved on. Her name lit up my phone after months of silence. I stared at it and said, "This won't change anything." I answered anyway. "Hi," she said. I replied, "You can talk." She hesitated, then said, "I don't know where to start." I said, "Then don't lie." She breathed out and said, "I feel trapped." I asked, "By what?" She said, "By the life I chose." I stayed quiet. She continued, "Daniel isn't who he was." I said, "People rarely are." She replied, "He's angry all the time." I asked, "At you?" She said, "At everything." I listened without interrupting. She said, "He resents the pregnancy." I nodded even though she couldn't see me. "That happens," I said. She whispered, "I miss the stability you gave me." I leaned back and said, "Stability wasn't enough then." She said, "I didn't know how much it mattered." I replied, "I told you." She paused and said, "I know." I waited. She said, "I regret lying." I answered, "Regret comes late." She asked softly, "Do you hate me?" I said, "No, that surprised us both." She started crying and said, "I ruined everything." I replied, "You changed everything." She said, "I thought passion mattered more." I answered, "You chose excitement over honesty." She said, "I didn't think it would cost this much." I replied, "Choices don't show prices up front." She sniffed and said, "You sound calm." I said, "I am." She asked, "How did you get there?" I replied, "By accepting reality." She said, "I miss how safe I felt with you." I answered, "Safety felt boring to you." She whispered, "I was wrong." I said, "Being wrong doesn't rewind time." She asked, "Do you ever miss me?" I answered honestly, "I miss who I thought you were." She went quiet. I heard her breathe. "Daniel says you never understood me," she said. I replied, "Understanding requires truth." She said, "I was scared to be honest." I answered, "Fear doesn't excuse damage." She said, "I feel like I'm paying for it now." I replied, "Consequences aren't punishment. They're results." She said, "I wish I had listened." I replied, "I wish you had spoken." She asked, "Do you think we could ever talk again someday?" I smiled without humor and said, "We're talking now." She said, "You know what I mean." I answered, "I already did. You just didn't listen back then." She cried harder. "I didn't mean to hurt you," she said. I replied, "Intent doesn't change outcome." She asked, "Are you happy?" I thought for a moment and said, "I'm at peace." She whispered, "I envy that." I said, "Peace comes from responsibility." She said, "I don't know who I am anymore." I replied, "That's something you have to face." She said, "I thought you'd yell." I answered, "I'm done fighting." She said, "I deserve that." I replied, "This isn't about what you deserve." She asked, "Then what is it about?" I said, "What I accept." She paused and said, "I wanted to hear your voice." I answered, "Now you have." She asked, "Will you ever forgive me?" I said, "I already let go." She said, "That's not forgiveness." I replied, "It's freedom." She whispered, "I miss you." I answered, "I miss my peace more." She went silent. I waited, then said, "Take care of yourself." She said, "You too." I ended the call and set the phone down. My hands were steady. I didn't feel proud or cruel. I felt finished. I said out loud, "I chose myself." The room stayed quiet, and for once, that quiet didn't ask anything from me at all. I didn't rush into anything with Sophia, even when she sat across from me at lunch and said, "You don't have to explain yourself to me." "I know," I said, stirring my coffee. "That's why I feel safe talking to you." She smiled gently. "Safe doesn't mean stuck." Those words stayed with me. I wanted closeness, but fear still lived in my chest. I told her, I'm scared I won't see the warning signs again. She nodded. Then we go slow. Or we don't go at all. You choose. That was new to me, choice without pressure. Mark called me one night and said, Emily had the baby. I leaned against the kitchen counter. Okay. That's it? He asked. What do you want me to feel? I said. He hesitated. Daniel wasn't really there. He showed up late. Left early. I closed my eyes. I hope the child is healthy. That's all? That's all, I said, and meant it. After the call, I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I felt finished. Sophia noticed the quiet the next day. Something heavy? My past knocking, I said. Do you want to open the door? No, I replied. I already moved on. That weekend, I packed old photos into a box. I said out loud, you don't get to follow me anymore. Then I threw the box away. I stood by the window holding my wedding ring. You meant something once, I whispered. Just not forever. I dropped it into the river and felt lighter. When I moved apartments, Mark helped. He asked, you ever think about revenge? I shook my head. Living well felt harder. He smiled. You did it anyway. That night, Sophia helped me unpack. She held up a mug and said, new memories? I nodded. Careful ones. She met my eyes. That's enough. I realized then I hadn't lost my life. I made room for a better one. I wake up without dread now. I say, morning, to an empty room and smile. At work, Sophia asks, coffee? I answer, yes, please. We sit by the window and she says, you seem settled. I reply, I finally tell the truth to myself. She nods and says, that matters. I like that she listens more than she speaks. We talk about trust. She asks, what does it look like to you? I think and say, consistency. She smiles and says, for me, it's patience. I add, and honesty, even when it's boring. She laughs softly. Especially then, she says. There is no rush in her voice. I feel no pressure to perform or promise. Later, Mark calls and says, you sound different. I reply, I am. He asks, happy? I say, grounded. He pauses and says, that's better. We hang up without advice. I cook dinner and eat it while standing, then sit, then slow down. Peace feels practical. Sophia walks with me after work. She says, I'm not asking for anything. I answer, I know. She adds, I just like being here. I say, me too. We stop at the corner and she asks, can we keep it simple? I reply, that's the plan. She smiles, and that's enough. My phone buzzes. It's Emily. The message says, I'm sorry for lying. I won't excuse it. I hope you're well. I read it twice and set the phone face down. I don't reply. I say to myself, forgiveness doesn't require access. The room agrees. I think about what happened and don't flinch. I say, I wasn't replaced. I say it again, quieter. I was released. I understand now that some people don't betray you because you're not enough. They betray because they don't know how to be whole. I didn't cause that. I can't cure it. Sophia texts, home safe? I reply, yes. She sends, good night. I answer, good night. There are no hidden meanings. I sleep. In the morning, I run and breathe and say, keep going. At work, I finish a project and say, done. Small wins count. Rachel never messages again. Mark checks in and says, proud of you. I reply, thanks. That's all. I stand by the window and talk to myself. You chose dignity. I answer, you chose peace. I don't rehearse arguments anymore. I don't imagine apologies. I accept the quiet as earned. Sophia asks, what are you looking for? I say, a life that fits. She nods and says, let's see where this goes. I reply, slow is good. She agrees. I don't hate Emily. I don't need to. I forgive without reopening doors. I learned that love without truth is noise, and truth without kindness is cruelty. I choose both. I close the chapter of my past and don't burn it. I shelve it. I didn't lose a wife. I escaped a lie, and I kept myself. That is my ending, and my beginning. Later, Sophia says, trust grows when actions match words. I reply, that's what I need. She asks, are you afraid? I answer, sometimes. She says, we can go slow. I say, please. She smiles and says, then we're aligned. I meet Mark for lunch. He says, any regrets? I answer, only staying silent too long. He says, you learned. I reply, I did. He asks, what would you tell your past self? I say, ask harder questions. He nods and says, and listen to the answers. At home, I sort old boxes. I say, keep, then, donate, then, trash. Each choice feels clean. I find a note and say, goodbye. I don't read it. I throw it away and feel lighter. Emily's message stays unread after the first time. I don't reopen it. I don't draft responses. I don't rehearse forgiveness speeches. I live instead. I make plans for the weekend and text Sophia, hike? She replies, yes. I say, Saturday? She says, perfect. I look in the mirror and say, you're enough. I wait, then say it again. I breathe and feel steady. I step outside and think, this is mine. No one argues. The world keeps moving, and I move with it, choosing honesty, choosing calm, choosing myself, every single day. I remember the lessons and say, boundaries are love. I repeat it until it sticks. Sophia hears me and asks, everything okay? I answer, better than okay. She says, I like that. I reply, me too. We stand quietly, sharing space. I feel present, not perfect. I choose tomorrow without fear, carrying truth lightly, trusting my steps, and welcoming peace as something I earned, not something I borrowed. That choice feels permanent now, steady and kind, and I accept it fully, knowing my life finally belongs to me without doubt or apology ever.